There is a moment many people never forget. The moment when they realize the person they trusted most, the person they defended when everyone else saw red flags, has been the one causing the deepest harm. It is a moment that breaks not only the heart, but also the perception of reality itself. In that quiet space of realization, there is often confusion. You might hear yourself thinking, how did I not see it sooner? Why did I spend so long excusing what was never acceptable? And beneath that confusion is an even darker truth. Your own mind has been working against you. When we talk about loving someone, the common image is warmth, safety, and devotion. Society paints love as an antidote to harm, as if affection could erase cruelty or shield us from danger. Parents tell children that love is the most powerful force in the world. Movies romanticize forgiveness, sacrifice, and loyalty, even when it borders on self-destruction. Yet hidden beneath these narratives is something unspoken. Love, while deeply human, can blind us to truths we cannot bear to face. And in that blindness lies the perfect environment for harm to grow unnoticed. In psychology, there is a term for this self-deceptive blindness. It is known as confirmation bias. It is the human tendency to search for, interpret, and recall information in a way that supports what we already believe. In the context of relationships, especially abusive or toxic ones, confirmation bias acts like a silent architect. It arranges memories to favor hope rather than reality. It highlights moments of kindness while dismissing evidence of harm. Over time, this bias does not just distort perception, it reshapes reality itself. This is where dark psychology enters the conversation. Dark psychology is the study of how human behavior and thought can be used to manipulate, control, or harm others. It is not just about the abuser's tactics, but also about the vulnerabilities within the victim's mind. One of the most exploited vulnerabilities is the very bias that convinces us love must be protected at all costs. When you are deeply invested in someone, your brain wants consistency. It clings to the belief that this person is good, even if evidence suggests otherwise. The conflict between belief and reality creates discomfort, and rather than face that discomfort, the mind resolves it by rewriting the narrative to maintain emotional stability. Imagine a partner who raises their voice, insults you, or belittles you in private. Later, they apologize with flowers, a gentle hug, and words of remorse. The brain, desperate for harmony, focuses on the apology rather than the insult. It highlights the soft moments, the fleeting kindness, and convinces you that the harm was accidental or temporary. Over time, this cycle repeats, and each repetition strengthens the bias. You do not just excuse the harm, you start to believe you are somehow responsible for it, or that enduring it is proof of love. This is not weakness, it is not foolishness, it is human. Confirmation bias is not a flaw exclusive to vulnerable people. It is a universal mechanism of the mind. When paired with the powerful emotions involved in loving someone, it can override rational judgment. Neuroscientists have shown that love activates reward pathways, similar to those triggered by addictive substances. That reward binds you emotionally, chemically, and cognitively. Even when harm becomes apparent, the brain fights to preserve the bond, because breaking it feels like a threat to survival itself. The hidden cost of blind love is profound. It is not only about enduring harm, it is about losing sight of who you are. Victims often emerge from abusive relationships, unsure of their own memories, their own values, and even their own identity. The deeper tragedy is that many do not recognize the blindness until the damage is irreversible. That recognition, when it comes, is often accompanied by guilt. Guilt for staying, guilt for defending, guilt for believing. Yet this guilt itself is another layer of harm, because it overlooks the truth. The blindness was not chosen. It was built by forces you did not fully see. The silence around this topic makes it even more dangerous. People are quick to judge victims of abuse. They ask why someone did not leave sooner, why they ignored the signs, why they loved someone who caused pain. But the real question is not why victims stay. It is why our minds are designed to protect illusions, even when reality demands otherwise. The answer, as unsettling as it is, lies in the very mechanisms that make us human. The stories we hear about love, from the moment we are children, are rarely neutral. They are stories shaped by culture, by family, and by countless narratives in films, books, and even songs. These stories carry a quiet promise that love is pure, protective, and ultimately redemptive. We grow up believing that if we find the right person, everything painful will be healed. The lie is subtle, but powerful. It tells us that love cannot harm us, only save us. This belief plants a seed that can later make us blind to harm when it does appear. When you are young, you are taught that love is unconditional. Parents repeat the phrase that love conquers all, and society celebrates loyalty as the ultimate virtue. Yet unconditional love, when placed in the wrong hands, can become a weapon. It can justify enduring mistreatment, because ending the relationship feels like betraying that ideal. The very foundation of what you were taught becomes the chain that keeps you in place. When harm comes from someone you love, the mind struggles to hold two truths at once. One truth says this person is hurting me. The other truth says love should forgive and endure. Confirmation bias steps in, silencing the first truth so the second can remain intact. In the field of dark psychology, this conflict is not accidental. Abusers, whether consciously or unconsciously, exploit the cultural myth of love's purity. They know that victims will seek reasons to excuse harm rather than confront it. The more deeply you invest in the image of what love should be, the more blind you become to what love truly is in front of you. This blindness is not simply emotional, it is cognitive. Your brain begins filtering experiences, holding on to moments of affection while pushing away memories of harm. Over time, this selective attention builds a distorted reality where harm feels normal and kindness feels extraordinary. Consider how this belief shapes your daily choices. You may remember the time they smiled at you during your darkest hour, but forget the sharp words that cut you minutes later. You may justify their actions as stress, exhaustion, or misunderstanding. You tell yourself everyone has flaws, everyone makes mistakes, everyone deserves patience. Slowly, the idea of leaving feels like abandoning not only the person but the very belief system you were raised to trust. It feels like betraying love itself. The lie is reinforced by the outside world. Friends may tell you to stay strong, to keep loving through the hard times. Family may encourage forgiveness rather than confrontation. Films glorify dramatic reconciliations, where love survives impossible odds. These cultural reinforcements merge with personal hope, creating a powerful internal barrier against truth. Breaking that barrier requires not just emotional courage, but cognitive clarity. And clarity is difficult when your own perception has been quietly rewritten by bias. The most dangerous aspect of this lie is how invisible it becomes over time. You do not wake up one day and decide to ignore harm. It happens gradually, a slow erosion of boundaries and self-respect. By the time you notice the damage, the belief is already rooted deep within you. This is why understanding confirmation bias is critical. It is not simply an academic concept. It is the hidden lens through which you interpret every gesture, every word, every emotion with the person you love. The truth is unsettling, but necessary. Love, by itself, does not guarantee safety. It does not guarantee kindness, nor does it ensure respect. Without awareness, love can bind you to harm as tightly as it can connect you to joy. This realization is painful, yet it opens the first door toward understanding the darker side of human connection. The sooner we confront this truth, the sooner we can begin to see what love actually is, rather than what we wish it to be. Confirmation bias is one of the most studied yet underestimated forces in psychology. It operates quietly beneath the surface of conscious thought, shaping how people perceive, interpret, and remember events in their lives. At its core, confirmation bias is the human tendency to favor information that supports what we already believe, and to dismiss evidence that contradicts it. This is not an occasional mistake of judgment. It is a constant filter through which the mind processes reality, and in relationships, particularly when loving someone, This filter can have devastating effects. When you care deeply for another person, your belief in their goodness becomes a foundation for emotional security. That belief anchors you, so when harmful behavior surfaces, the bias compels your mind to reinterpret it in a way that preserves the foundation rather than shattering it. If they yell at you, you might tell yourself they were under stress. If they lie, you convince yourself it was to protect you. These rationalizations are not chosen consciously. They arise from the mind's desire to maintain internal harmony between love and lived experience. The influence of confirmation bias extends beyond isolated incidents. It reshapes memory itself. Studies in cognitive psychology have shown that people recall events differently depending on their expectations and emotional attachments. In relationships colored by abuse or toxicity, this means the loving moments are amplified and encoded deeply, while the harmful ones fade into the background. Over time, the story you tell yourself about the relationship becomes selective, favoring comfort over accuracy. Dark psychology examines this phenomenon closely, not only from the victim's perspective, but also from the manipulators. Individuals who exploit others, whether deliberately or instinctively, often benefit from this bias, without needing to orchestrate it directly. By offering occasional rewards, such as a kind word, a moment of affection, or an apology after harm, they provide just enough evidence to satisfy the bias. The victim's mind clings to these fragments of hope, using them as proof that the relationship is worth preserving. This dynamic creates a powerful trap. The more you invest emotionally, the stronger your bias becomes. Every sacrifice you make reinforces the belief that the other person must be worth it, because admitting otherwise would mean admitting you have been hurt without reason. This is a painful truth many people cannot face until the harm has escalated beyond denial. In understanding confirmation bias, we begin to see why leaving abusive relationships can feel nearly impossible. It is not simply fear of the abuser, nor only practical barriers like financial dependence or social stigma. It is the internal war between belief and evidence, a war that the bias almost always wins until something breaks the cycle. The power of confirmation bias becomes even more apparent when we explore how it operates within daily interactions over time. In a relationship where abuse exists, the victim does not only justify the harm, but also begins to anticipate explanations for it before it even happens. This anticipation strengthens the bias because the mind is constantly searching for ways to make harmful behavior fit the existing belief that the person they love is good. It is as if the brain is actively rewriting reality in real time to avoid emotional collapse. Consider the common cycle of idealization and devaluation. At the start, the abuser often presents themselves as perfect, showering the victim with affection and attention. This period creates powerful emotional memories that become the foundation of the victim's belief in the relationship. When harm occurs later, the victim does not discard the early memories. Instead, they use those memories as evidence that the harm must be temporary. They say to themselves, this is not who they really are. The mind then filters every new event, holding on to any small positive sign and ignoring the growing pattern of negativity. Research in dark psychology has documented this process extensively. Experiments in cognitive dissonance reveal that when people invest significant emotional or physical effort into a relationship, they are far more likely to justify harmful treatment to protect their sense of purpose. The greater the sacrifice, the stronger the need to believe the sacrifice was worth it. This is why so many intelligent, capable people stay in harmful relationships far longer than outsiders can comprehend. It is not a lack of awareness, but a deep psychological need to protect the narrative that their love is meaningful. The bias does not only distort memories of the other person, it also distorts self-perception. Victims often begin to view themselves as flawed, unworthy, or even deserving of harm. If the abuser apologizes by saying you provoked them or caused their anger, the mind accepts this explanation because it aligns with the need to maintain belief in the relationship. Over time, this internalization of blame erodes self-esteem and deepens dependence on the very person causing the harm. In professional settings, such as therapy, breaking this bias is one of the most challenging aspects of recovery. It requires dismantling not only the illusions about the abuser, but also the illusions about oneself. The victim must learn to separate love from harm, loyalty from self-sacrifice, and forgiveness from denial. This process is slow and painful because it involves confronting the possibility that years of memory and meaning were built on distorted perceptions. Yet without this confrontation, the cycle continues, often leading to repeated patterns in future relationships. The tragedy is that confirmation bias is not inherently malicious. It evolved as a mental shortcut to help humans make quick decisions and reduce uncertainty. In everyday life, it can even be beneficial. However, in the context of loving someone who harms you, it becomes a weapon turned inward. It silences alarm bells that should be ringing and convinces you that enduring pain is an act of devotion rather than a signal of danger. The emotional power of loving someone is not only psychological, it is deeply rooted in biology, in the chemical messengers and neural circuits that govern how human beings form attachments. When people speak about falling in love, they often describe feelings of euphoria, obsession, or even addiction. Modern neuroscience confirms that these descriptions are not exaggerated. Love activates some of the same reward pathways in the brain as powerful drugs. Understanding this biological foundation is essential to understanding why confirmation bias becomes so potent in abusive relationships. When you first form a bond with someone, your brain releases dopamine. This neurotransmitter is responsible for the feeling of pleasure and reward. Every affectionate gesture, every tender word reinforces the connection by triggering dopamine surges. Over time, this reward system becomes conditioned to associate the person with safety and happiness. Even when harmful behavior occurs, the memory of those dopamine highs lingers, pulling you back toward the person despite the pain they cause. It is a biological echo of better times that blinds you to the present reality. Another chemical, oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone, plays a crucial role in deepening attachment. Oxytocin is released during moments of physical closeness, such as hugging, kissing, or intimacy. It enhances trust and fosters a sense of security. In a healthy relationship, oxytocin strengthens bonds that promote mutual care and cooperation. In an abusive dynamic, however, it can trap the victim in a cycle of forgiveness and hope. After every harmful episode, moments of reconciliation release oxytocin, making the victim feel close to the abuser again and reinforcing the belief that the relationship is worth preserving. The stress hormone cortisol also has a role in this cycle. During conflicts or episodes of harm, cortisol levels rise, increasing anxiety and alertness. However, when reconciliation follows, the return to safety feels overwhelmingly relieving. This contrast between stress and erosion creates an emotional roller coaster that intensifies attachment. It is not unlike gambling, where the unpredictability of reward makes the behavior even more addictive. The brain learns to crave not only the highs of affection, but also the relief from distress that follows periods of harm. These neurochemical patterns explain why confirmation bias becomes so deeply embedded in love. The brain is not merely seeking evidence that aligns with belief. It is also seeking the chemical comfort associated with that belief. When evidence threatens the connection, the brain experiences it as a threat to survival itself. In evolutionary terms, human beings are wired to prioritize social bonds because isolation historically meant danger. This wiring remains powerful today, even when the bond in question is harmful. Dark psychology recognizes this vulnerability and examines how it can be exploited. Manipulators may unknowingly or deliberately trigger these chemical responses, alternating between harm and reward to strengthen control. They may withdraw affection to induce anxiety, then provide comfort to create relief. Over time, this cycle creates what psychologists call trauma bonding, where intense emotional highs and lows bind the victim to the abuser more tightly than consistent kindness ever could. The more we understand the biology of attachment, the clearer it becomes why loving someone can cloud judgment even in the presence of harm. The brain is not simply making choices based on logic. It is responding to chemical signals that evolved to promote closeness and survival. These same signals that once helped protect early human communities can, in the modern world, bind individuals to destructive relationships. Consider how the brain's reward system responds to unpredictability. Studies on behavioral conditioning have shown that intermittent reinforcement, where rewards are given at irregular intervals, creates the strongest behavioral persistence. In relationships, this manifests when an abuser alternates between affection and cruelty. The victim never knows when kindness will return, which paradoxically deepens their attachment. Each rare moment of warmth feels more precious precisely because it is rare. The mind, flooded with dopamine and oxytocin during those moments, clings to them as proof that the relationship can still be saved. This neurochemical tug-of-war also explains why leaving an abusive relationship often feels like withdrawal. When the bond is severed, dopamine and oxytocin levels drop, while cortisol surges in response to stress and loneliness. Victims describe this experience as both emotional and physical pain. Their bodies crave the very person who hurt them, not because the harm is forgotten, but because the body remembers the highs that followed reconciliation. In this way, biology reinforces confirmation bias, urging the victim to interpret harm as temporary and love as permanent. The complexity increases when we add memory into this cycle. Neuroimaging studies reveal that emotional memories are stored differently from neutral ones. The brain prioritizes emotionally charged events, but it does not always prioritize them accurately. In toxic relationships, this means that the intense relief following reconciliation can overshadow the pain that preceded it. Over time, the brain rewires itself to associate the abuser, not with harm, but with the relief from harm. This distorted memory reinforces the belief that staying is safer than leaving. Dark psychology examines this intersection of biology and manipulation in depth. Skilled manipulators, whether consciously or unconsciously, exploit these neurochemical processes. By controlling the timing of affection and withdrawal, they create cycles of hope and despair, knowing that the victim's brain will cling to even the smallest sign of improvement. This is why many victims describe the first few months of abuse as the hardest to identify. The emotional intensity of early love creates a benchmark that the brain spends months or even years chasing. Breaking this cycle requires more than insight. It demands physiological recalibration. Survivors often report that healing begins not only when they recognize the psychological pattern, but when their body stops craving the chemical highs associated with the abuser. This process is slow and can feel disorienting. It involves relearning what safety feels like and rebuilding trust in oneself rather than in the unreliable promises of another. The tragedy is that these neurochemical patterns are not inherently harmful. In healthy relationships, they strengthen trust and deepen intimacy. Yet, when paired with abuse, they become chains. The same biology that allows us to bond with others so profoundly also makes it painfully difficult to break free when that bond turns toxic. This is the hidden cost of loving someone without understanding how deeply the body participates in that love. The relationship between an abuser and a victim is rarely defined by constant harm. It is defined by cycles. These cycles shift between kindness and cruelty, creating a psychological pattern that traps the victim and reinforces the abuser's control. Understanding this cycle is crucial because it reveals how both conscious manipulation and unconscious bias work together to maintain the bond, even when the relationship is destructive. The cycle often begins with idealization. At this stage, the abuser presents themselves as attentive, caring, and unusually understanding. This idealization is powerful because it creates a sense of safety and belonging that the victim may have been searching for. In many cases, this early phase feels so intensely positive that it establishes an emotional anchor point. The brain begins to equate this person with happiness, and confirmation bias starts working to preserve that belief. When harm begins later, the mind compares every moment of abuse to the initial idealization, and clings to the hope that things can return to how they once were. As the relationship progresses, the dynamic shifts to devaluation. Subtle criticisms may appear first, disguised as concern or advice. Over time, these criticisms escalate into overt insults, emotional neglect, or even physical harm. Each harmful act chips away at the victim's self-worth, yet confirmation bias encourages reinterpretation. Instead of seeing abuse, the victim may view these behaviors as signs of stress, misunderstanding, or personal failure. They may begin to believe that if they change their own actions, the kindness will return. The cycle does not end there. After harm comes reconciliation. The abuser offers apologies, gifts, or brief periods of affection, reinforcing the belief that the relationship can be repaired. This intermittent reward system strengthens attachment in a way that continuous kindness does not. The victim experiences relief, and the brain encodes this relief as proof that the abuser still cares. The pain of the abuse becomes blurred by the joy of the reconciliation, and the cycle begins again. Dark psychology identifies this pattern as particularly dangerous because it exploits two core human vulnerabilities: the desire for love and the fear of abandonment. Victims caught in this cycle often struggle to distinguish genuine affection from manipulation. Over time, the abuse becomes normalized, and the cycle itself begins to feel like proof of love. The highs feel so intense that they overshadow the lows, even when the lows become increasingly severe. Professionals in trauma research describe this cycle as cognitive distortion. The victim's perception of reality bends to accommodate the contradictions in the relationship. They know harm is occurring, yet they convince themselves it is temporary, deserved, or somehow outweighed by the good. The longer this continues, the harder it becomes to separate illusion from truth. The longer this cycle continues, the deeper the psychological distortions become. Victims begin to internalize the abuser's narratives, believing they are responsible for the harm. This shift in self-perception is not sudden, but gradual, built moment by moment as each act of kindness from the abuser is seen as evidence of love, while each act of cruelty is reframed as an isolated mistake or something provoked. Over time, the victim begins to expect harm and simultaneously hope for relief, creating a mental loop that is extremely difficult to break. Confirmation bias strengthens this cycle because the mind searches relentlessly for signs that support the belief in love. Even during periods of severe abuse, small gestures like a soft tone of voice or a fleeting smile are magnified in memory. In contrast, patterns of harm are minimized or forgotten. The victim clings to the fragments that confirm the relationship's worth and ignores the overwhelming evidence that it is toxic. This is not weakness, it is a survival mechanism. Admitting the full extent of harm would force the victim to confront a devastating truth that feels unbearable. Abusers, whether consciously aware or not, often exploit this vulnerability. They create conditions where love and fear coexist, ensuring that their partner feels unable to leave. This is seen in tactics like gaslighting, where the abuser denies events or twists facts, causing the victim to doubt their own memory and judgment. When someone you trust insists that your perception is wrong, the dissonance between belief and reality deepens. The victim, desperate for stability, resolves the conflict by trusting the abuser's version of events instead of their own instincts. The result is a profound erosion of autonomy. The victim becomes increasingly dependent on the abuser for validation, guidance, and even definitions of reality. Decisions about safety, worth, and love are no longer self-determined, but filtered through the lens of the abuser's control. This dependence makes leaving feel impossible, not only because of external barriers like finances or social pressure, but because the victim no longer trusts themselves to interpret their own experience accurately. Dark psychology studies this dependency to understand why harmful relationships can persist for years or even decades. It is not simply about fear or practical limitations. It is about a mental prison built on distorted beliefs and reinforced by emotional highs and lows. Breaking free requires more than physical separation. It demands a complete restructuring of how the victim understands love, safety, and self-worth. Without that restructuring, even physical distance cannot guarantee freedom, because the mental patterns linger long after the relationship ends. The tragedy of this cycle is that it often remains invisible to outsiders. Friends and family may see the harm clearly and wonder why the victim stays, but from inside the cycle, leaving feels like abandoning hope, love, and identity all at once. This is why survivors often describe the moment of clarity, when they finally see the pattern for what it is, as both liberating and devastating. It is the moment when the illusion shatters and reality can no longer be denied. When someone remains in a relationship shaped by abuse and distorted love for a long period, the damage reaches far beyond temporary emotional wounds. It begins to erode reality itself. What was once clear becomes clouded, and what was once unquestionable becomes uncertain. This gradual erosion is not immediately visible. It happens so subtly that the person living through it rarely notices until their sense of self feels hollow. This is one of the most dangerous outcomes of loving someone under the influence of confirmation bias and dark psychology. The human mind relies on consistent reference points to maintain a sense of reality. These reference points include personal memories, emotional responses, and social feedback from others. In abusive relationships, all three of these pillars are attacked. Gaslighting, a common tactic used by abusers, undermines memory by denying events or reshaping them to suit their narrative. Emotional manipulations destabilizes responses, causing confusion about what is normal or acceptable. Social isolation cuts off external validation, leaving the victim reliant on the abuser for perspective. Over time, these combined tactics create a closed system in which only the abuser's reality is allowed to exist. Confirmation bias intensifies this isolation. Once the victim begins to doubt themselves, their mind naturally searches for any evidence that the abuser is right. Small moments of kindness or affection are magnified as proof that the relationship is worth saving, while harm is minimized or rationalized. This selective processing makes the victim feel increasingly detached from objective truth. The longer this continues, the more their personal identity becomes intertwined with the distorted view of love provided by the abuser. The psychological cost of this erosion is immense. Victims may lose confidence in their ability to make decisions, to trust their own judgment, or even to interpret reality accurately. They may feel like they are living in two worlds at once: the world they sense internally, and the world the abuser insists is true. This conflict can create chronic anxiety, depression, and a persistent state of confusion. Many survivors describe this as feeling like a fog, where even simple choices feel overwhelming because nothing feels solid anymore. Philosophically, this raises disturbing questions about the nature of identity itself. If reality can be shaped so thoroughly by another person, how stable is the self we believe in? Can love, in its darkest form, dismantle the very foundation of who we are? These questions are not abstract in the context of abuse. They are lived experiences for those whose sense of self has been dismantled piece by piece. As the erosion of reality deepens, identity does not simply weaken. It begins to merge with the abuser's expectations and perceptions. The victim's self-concept shifts from "who am I" to "who do they want me to be?" Over time, pleasing the abuser becomes not only a survival strategy, but a central part of self-worth. Every decision, from daily routines to long-term goals, becomes filtered through the question of whether it will prevent conflict or earn affection. This dynamic fosters dependence, and that dependence cements the cycle of harm. This loss of self is rarely dramatic at first. It begins with small concessions, agreeing to keep quiet during arguments, avoiding friends who voice concern, downplaying personal needs to maintain harmony. Each concession feels minor, even logical, in the moment, but collectively they carve away independence until the victim no longer recognizes themselves. This is why many survivors describe looking back at photos or journals from before the relationship and feeling like they are seeing a stranger. The person they once were feels distant, unreachable, and in some cases entirely gone. Confirmation bias magnifies this transformation by selectively validating the abuser's narrative. When the abuser claims that no one else would love the victim, the mind unconsciously searches for evidence to confirm it. Friends who have drifted away, family tensions, even moments of personal doubt become proof that the abuser is right. In this way, the victim's reality narrows further, creating a closed loop where the only consistent truth is the abuser's voice. Dark psychology research explores how prolonged exposure to this kind of mental conditioning mirrors the effects of coercive control seen in cult dynamics. Both involve isolation, manipulation, and the gradual reshaping of belief systems. The victim stops trusting external perspectives and internal instincts, relying solely on the controlling figure for validation. This control is so complete that even imagining life beyond the relationship feels impossible. Fear of the unknown replaces fear of harm, locking the victim in place. This erosion does not only impact mental health, it has physical consequences as well. Chronic stress alters hormone levels, weakens the immune system, and disrupts sleep patterns. Survivors often report symptoms resembling post-traumatic stress, including hypervigilance, intrusive memories, and emotional numbness. These symptoms persist even after the relationship ends, because the brain has adapted to living in a constant state of threat and uncertainty. Rebuilding identity after such an experience is a slow and painful process. It requires more than leaving the abusive environment. It requires reclaiming the capacity to trust one's own mind. Survivors must relearn how to interpret their emotions, rebuild confidence in their perceptions, and rediscover values independent of the relationship. This is not merely recovery, it is reconstruction, a deliberate effort to become whole again after being dismantled piece by piece. The deepest tragedy lies in how unnoticed this erosion can be. Outsiders may see the signs of harm, but rarely understand the depth of identity loss taking place. To them, leaving might appear simple. To the victim, leaving feels like stepping into emptiness, because the self they once relied on has been dismantled by the very love they clung to. One of the most persistent myths about abusive relationships is that only naive or uninformed individuals become trapped in them. This belief is not only inaccurate, but deeply harmful, as it silences many victims and fosters shame. In reality, intelligence does not provide immunity against confirmation bias or dark psychology. Some of the most capable and insightful individuals find themselves entangled in harmful relationships, wondering how they could have missed the warning signs. Understanding why this happens requires examining the unique ways love and bias interact in the human mind. Intelligent individuals are often skilled at rationalizing their experiences. Their ability to analyze and reason can become a double-edged sword when applied to relationships. Rather than confronting harm directly, they may create elaborate explanations to justify it. They might interpret abuse as stress-related behavior, childhood trauma resurfacing, or evidence of deeper complexity in their partner's character. These explanations feel sophisticated, yet they serve the same function as any denial, preserving the belief that love is worth protecting. Confirmation bias is particularly insidious for people who pride themselves on being logical. Once they have committed to the belief that their partner is good, they unconsciously seek evidence to confirm it. Every kind gesture, every apology, every fleeting smile becomes proof that they are right. Negative events are reframed as exceptions or misunderstandings rather than patterns. In this way, intelligence does not shield them from bias. It equips them with better tools to defend it. Another factor is emotional investment. Highly intelligent people often set high standards for themselves in relationships. They value loyalty, depth, and meaning. When they commit fully. This depth of commitment makes it harder to walk away, even when harm becomes undeniable. Admitting that the relationship is unhealthy feels like admitting personal failure, and the more effort they have invested, the harder it becomes to accept that effort was misplaced. Dark psychology research reveals that abusers sometimes seek partners who are empathetic and conscientious, qualities that often accompany high emotional intelligence. Such partners are more likely to forgive, to understand, and to look for the good in others. These traits, while admirable in healthy contexts, can become vulnerabilities in abusive ones. The abuser learns to exploit this empathy, alternating between harm and remorse to maintain control. Cultural expectations also play a role. Many intelligent individuals believe they should be able to solve problems through insight and communication. They approach relationship difficulties as challenges to be understood rather than threats to be escaped. This problem-solving mindset can keep them engaged in harmful dynamics. Long after others might have left, they convince themselves that with enough patience and understanding, they can help their partner change. Intelligence also fosters optimism in ways that can prolong harmful relationships. People who see themselves as problem solvers often believe they can outthink the harm they are experiencing. They may view abuse as a puzzle that can be solved rather than as a danger that must be escaped. This belief fuels persistence, leading them to search for solutions that do not exist, all while enduring increasing harm in the hope of eventual improvement. The complexity of loving someone intensifies this trap. Emotional bonds are not rational, and the stronger the love, the stronger the mind's instinct to defend it. Intelligent individuals often possess deep introspection, which can ironically make them more prone to self-blame. Instead of recognizing that the abuser's behavior is unacceptable, they examine their own actions endlessly, wondering what they could do differently to restore peace. This self-scrutiny provides endless material for confirmation bias to work with, because every small misstep becomes proof that the fault lies with them rather than with the person harming them. Cognitive dissonance plays a critical role here. When intelligent individuals encounter evidence that contradicts their belief in the relationship's goodness, they experience intense discomfort. To resolve this discomfort, they do not abandon the belief. They reinterpret the evidence instead. This reinterpretation often takes the form of elaborate justifications. The abuse is excused as temporary stress, a reaction to external pressures, or even as a misguided form of love. The mind bends reality to preserve emotional security, creating an illusion that feels safer than the truth. Dark psychology research shows that abusers often exploit this cognitive dissonance by carefully alternating cruelty with gestures of care. The inconsistency itself becomes addictive. The victim holds on to memories of kindness as evidence of potential, ignoring the harm in between. This intermittent reinforcement is one of the most powerful conditioning tools known in psychology, rivaling the effects of addictive substances on the brain. It traps victims in a constant state of waiting for the next moment of relief. The tragedy is that intelligence can make this conditioning even more difficult to break. Intelligent victims often analyze their abuser's behavior obsessively, searching for hidden meaning or potential solutions. This constant analysis keeps them engaged in the relationship, unable to step back and see the broader pattern of harm. Their very skills of observation and reasoning, which serve them well in other areas of life, become liabilities in this context. Ultimately, intelligence does not protect against abuse, because abuse exploits universal human vulnerabilities. Love, attachment, and the desire for meaning are not weaknesses. They are core parts of being human. When these qualities intersect with confirmation bias and the manipulations of dark psychology, even the most discerning individuals can become blind to danger. The challenge is not to be smarter than the bias, but to recognize that no one is immune to it. There comes a moment in many harmful relationships when the illusion begins to crack. It is rarely a dramatic scene. More often, it is a quiet realization that grows slowly over time. A comment that once rolled off your back now lingers in your mind. An apology that once felt sincere now feels rehearsed. This moment, fragile yet powerful, is the beginning of awareness. Psychologists call this the turning point, the shift from denial toward recognition of reality. At first, awareness does not feel liberating. It feels unsettling. The same belief system that once kept you safe now begins to crumble. and with it, the security you thought love provided. Realizing the harm is not temporary or accidental but part of a pattern can trigger a flood of conflicting emotions. Anger, sadness, shame, and even guilt collide as you confront the truth you worked so hard to avoid. This is why so many people resist awareness, even when friends and family plead with them to see what is happening. Awareness means facing the collapse of not only a relationship, but also an identity built around that relationship. Confirmation bias fights hardest at this stage. The mind floods with memories of kindness, of laughter, of fleeting moments of connection. Each memory whispers that maybe things are not as bad as they seem. This mental tug-of-war is exhausting, leaving victims stuck between the desire to confront reality and the urge to retreat into familiar illusions. The more deeply you loved someone, the more painful this conflict becomes, because love amplifies hope even in the presence of harm. Dark psychology research explains why this stage feels so disorienting. Abusers often sense when their control is weakening and respond by intensifying manipulation. They may increase acts of kindness, make promises to change, or escalate guilt tactics. These behaviors temporarily soothe the victim's doubts, pulling them back into the cycle. This is why many survivors describe leaving and returning multiple times before breaking free completely. The mind clings to hope, even when that hope prolongs suffering. Despite the turmoil, this turning point is critical. It is the first step toward reclaiming autonomy. Recognizing the pattern of harm, even if action does not follow immediately, plants a seed that grows quietly over time. This awareness cannot be unseen. Once you begin to notice the inconsistencies, the lies, and the repeated cycles of harm, each new incident reinforces the truth rather than the illusion. The shift may be slow, but it is irreversible. As awareness deepens, the conflict inside the victim intensifies. On one side is the emerging clarity that the relationship is harmful. On the other side is the profound fear of what comes next. If that truth is fully accepted, leaving does not only mean ending a bond, it means confronting years of memories, investments, and beliefs that have defined daily life. For many, this realization feels like stepping off a cliff into uncertainty. The familiar pain of staying can feel safer than the unknown pain of leaving. One of the most challenging aspects of this stage is the grief that accompanies it. Victims are not only grieving the harm done to them, but also the loss of the person they believed their partner to be. The hope that things might change begins to fade, and with it, the imagined future they once held tightly to. This grief can feel heavier than anger because it is layered with love. You are mourning someone who is still standing in front of you, someone you once believed would never cause you harm. Confirmation bias still lingers during this process, but its power begins to weaken. Instead of filtering reality to protect the relationship, the mind starts noticing contradictions it once ignored. A harsh word is no longer followed by quick forgiveness in your mind. A promise to change is no longer accepted at face value. Patterns that were once invisible now stand out sharply. This shift is disorienting but necessary, because recognizing patterns is the first step toward breaking them. Dark psychology studies show that this stage often triggers retaliation from the abuser. When control begins to slip, manipulation escalates. The abuser may resort to desperate tactics, from extreme affection to heightened intimidation, in an attempt to pull the victim back into compliance. This is one reason why the period around leaving is statistically the most dangerous for victims of abusive relationships. It is not only an emotional turning point but often a physical one as well. The disillusionment stage also marks the beginning of self-reconstruction. For the first time, the victim begins asking questions, not about the abuser, but about themselves. Who am I without this relationship? What do I want my life to look like? These questions, though frightening, signal a reclaiming of identity. They shift focus from the harm done to the potential for healing. It is in this fragile space, where clarity and fear coexist, that true change begins to take root. The turning point is not the end of the journey, but it is the most critical moment of awakening. It marks the first time the victim sees reality clearly enough to imagine another way of living. Awareness does not erase love, but it exposes its cost. From this point forward, every choice is shaped by a deeper understanding of what staying means, and more importantly, what leaving could finally allow them to become. Reaching awareness is only the first step. The greater challenge is learning how to guide the mind out of the blindness that confirmation bias and dark psychology have created. By the time someone reaches this stage, their sense of love, trust, and self has often been altered in profound ways. Restoring clarity requires more than recognizing harm. It requires rebuilding the ability to interpret reality without distortion and reclaiming the belief that life beyond the relationship is possible. The first step in guiding the mind toward clarity is understanding how deeply bias has shaped perception. When you have spent months or years filtering reality to protect the idea of loving someone, your brain has built pathways that reinforce this narrative. Undoing those pathways cannot happen instantly. It begins with slow and deliberate questioning, asking simple but grounding questions, such as what actually happened and how did I feel in that moment, helps separate facts from the illusions created by hope or fear. These questions shift focus from defending the relationship to understanding the truth. Another critical element is reconnecting with external reality. Abusive relationships often involve isolation, cutting the victim off from friends, family, or support systems that might provide perspective. Rebuilding these connections is not only emotional support, but also cognitive recalibration. Hearing others validate your experiences helps counteract the distorted narratives you have internalized. It reminds you that your memories are real, your pain is valid, and your instincts are worth trusting. Dark psychology research emphasizes that recovery requires more than intellectual understanding. Trauma is stored in the body as well as the mind. Even when you recognize harm logically, your body may still react with anxiety, fear, or longing when you think about the abuser. This is why survivors often describe mixed emotions after leaving. They may feel both relief and craving, both safety and emptiness. Acknowledging these conflicting emotions is vital, because denying them only prolongs healing. It is normal to miss someone who hurt you, and it is normal to grieve the loss of a relationship even when you know leaving was necessary. Breaking the cycle also involves redefining love. Many survivors must confront the painful truth that what they once called love was shaped by control and fear. This realization can feel disorienting, but it opens space to redefine love on healthier terms. Love is not supposed to demand silence or sacrifice identity. It is not supposed to trade safety for loyalty. Understanding this helps survivors set new boundaries, ensuring that future relationships are built on respect rather than control. Rebuilding clarity after being caught in the cycle of abuse is a gradual process, and it begins with relearning trust in your own perception. For so long, the abuser's narrative replaced your own understanding of events. To reclaim yourself, you must start observing and validating your own emotions without judgment. This is not simply about remembering what happened, but about giving yourself permission to believe what you felt. When you begin to honor your own instincts, the fog that once clouded reality starts to lift. One of the most effective strategies for guiding the mind out of blindness is to document your experiences. Keeping a journal of events, emotions, and patterns provides an external record that is harder to distort. When confirmation bias tempts you to reinterpret harm as kindness, the written record serves as a reminder of consistent truths. Survivors often find that reading their own words weeks or months later helps break the cycle of selective memory that kept them trapped. It becomes undeniable evidence that harm was not an isolated moment, but part of a repeated pattern. Equally important is separating your identity from the abuser's influence. The person you were during the relationship is not the entirety of who you are. Abuse has a way of shrinking identity until it revolves entirely around the abuser's moods and expectations. Recovery requires expanding that identity again. This might involve rediscovering hobbies, reconnecting with people who affirm your worth, or simply allowing yourself to dream without fear of judgment. Small acts of self-discovery begin to rebuild the foundation of who you are beyond the relationship. Dark psychology research points out that many survivors struggle with feelings of guilt or shame. Even after gaining awareness, they wonder why they stayed so long, or why they failed to see the harm sooner. These feelings are common but misplaced. The blindness was never a personal flaw. It was the product of deliberate manipulation and natural cognitive biases. Healing begins when you release the burden of self-blame and recognize that surviving was itself an act of strength. Guiding the mind out of blindness is not about forgetting the past. It is about integrating the lessons of that past into a new understanding of love and self. Awareness does not erase the scars, but it transforms them into reminders of resilience. Over time, the memories that once caused confusion begin to serve as evidence of growth. You emerge with a clearer understanding of what love should and should not be, and this clarity becomes your protection moving forward. There is a moment, often quiet and deeply personal, when everything begins to make sense. The pieces of memory that never fit together finally align. The contradictions you once explained away reveal themselves as truths you can no longer deny. In that moment, the choice is no longer between staying or leaving. It becomes a choice between blindness and sight. The act of seeing is painful, yet it is the only path toward freedom. When you have spent so long loving someone through the lens of confirmation bias, the truth feels like betrayal. You grieve not only the person you believed they were, but also the version of yourself who believed in them. This grief is profound. It is the loss of imagined futures, of promises that once felt unshakable, and of trust you thought was mutual. Yet within that grief lies the first spark of liberation. To see clearly is to reclaim what was quietly stolen from you, your perception, your voice, and your right to define what love truly means. Dark psychology shows us that manipulation thrives in silence and confusion. When you break that silence, even if only inside yourself, the cycle begins to lose its power. You no longer accept love that harms you as inevitable. You begin to ask questions that were once unthinkable. Why do I defend pain as if it were devotion? Why do I excuse harm in the name of loyalty? These questions are not signs of weakness, but signs of awakening. They mark the point where love shifts from being an excuse for harm to being a reason to demand better. The choice to see is not a single decision, but a series of small acts. It is choosing to trust your memories when someone insists they are false. It is choosing to believe your feelings when you are told you are overreacting. It is choosing to step towards safety even when fear tells you to stay put. Each small act builds upon the last until the pattern that once seemed unbreakable begins. Fracture. Awareness grows quietly, then suddenly, until there is no going back to the blindness that once felt safe. The journey beyond blind love is not simple. It requires rebuilding what was lost, piece by piece. It means learning that love is not supposed to demand silence or erode who you are. It is supposed to support, uplift, and nurture. Anything less is not love, but control disguised as devotion. When you finally accept this truth, the power of confirmation bias begins to fade. The story you once told yourself about love transforms into something new, something grounded in clarity rather than illusion. This reflection is not about blaming yourself for what you endured. It is about honoring the courage it takes to see clearly. Many will never understand how difficult that choice is, how much strength it requires to dismantle the illusions built over years. But those who make that choice reclaim more than their freedom. They reclaim themselves. If you have felt the weight of this blindness, consider this a moment to breathe. Not every answer will come today. Not every wound will close quickly. But the act of seeing is the first step toward healing. And healing begins with awareness. Share this understanding with someone who may need it. Someone who may be waiting for the quiet permission to see what they have been afraid to face. And if this journey resonates with you, stay with it. There are more truths to uncover, more patterns to break, and more lives to reclaim in the study of dark psychology and the quiet courage of those who choose to see.